start with this image. This shows the age of petroleum and how it has affected global climate over the last 130 years. In 2009, WWF came out with a study entitled The Coral Triangle and Climate Change, where we pulled together 20 leading climate scientists to look at 300 peer-reviewed articles to give us an idea of how will climate change affect Southeast Asia, particularly our part of Southeast Asia. And there were 6 scenarios that came out. Number 1, El Nino was going to persist. The problem with El Nino is it makes things unpredictable. And that would make the future difficult to read because you wouldn't see the same patterns. Here in the Philippines, for example, we knew that there was a dry season and a wet season, but in some parts it changed, but it was always more or less the same. But that's no longer true. Second, see, El Nino is followed by La Nina, and very often El Nino is characterized by heightened sea temperatures. Why is this important? Here in the Philippines, sea temperatures are normally about 27.5 Celsius. But if you jump to 31, which often happens during El Nino, all the coral reefs die. Why is that important? Here in the Philippines, and maybe in your countries, many people depend on the sea as their primary source of protein, fish. And so, how then? No coral reefs, no fish. Big word. What does acidification mean? How many people here have planted a tree or a plant? Okay. How many people here understand the importance of pH? The balance between acidity and alkalinity, right? That's very important for the ocean as well. Acidification means, to a layman, that shrimps will no longer develop shells or skins. Oysters won't have shells. Fish may not be able to develop bones. What then happens to seafood? 4. In 2009, many of us thought that the melting sea ice of the Arctic would be the main criteria or the main dominant driver of sea level rise. Now we know it's not just ice melt. A lot of it is caused by thermal expansion. Thermal expansion, what does that mean? When you heat water, it expands, right? It steams, that's expansion. And thermal expansion simply means that we are in the hottest part of the world. Southeast Asia is practically on the equator, and therefore we will be mostly affected by thermal expansion. Here in the Philippines, this is no longer the future. We've seen this over the last 5-6 years. Every part of the country, virtually no part of our country has been exempt. And in many other places like Thailand, Vietnam, China, they have also seen this. Okay. Not necessarily an increase in the number of storms every year, but certainly an increase in the number of powerful storms. And finally, rainfall. You see, heat is the creator of rain. When there's a lot of heat, you have a lot of moisture, and all that blows in, and that falls. That's what they call the water cycle. We're seeing all of this. Those were the 6 scenarios that were predicted in 2009. It was also said that the impacts of climate change would be nonlinear and very site-specific. I'm using 4 maps of the Philippines to illustrate that. You see, according to the Manila Observatory, the areas in red, the areas on top, would be mostly affected by heat, while the areas in blue, in the southern part of my country, would be mostly affected by more rain. So you see, what will happen in the north is not necessarily the same as what would happen in the south. And if you go on an island-to-island basis or a province-to-province basis, this is what defines climate change, that it will have a different face in different country, different province. And therefore, to say, let's plan a climate program nationally, doesn't work, because the impacts are different from place to place. In Vietnam, for example, Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh, very different. And the planning should be very different. It should start from the local and then come together under a national plan. What else? Climate change is characterized by high variability. It's like having a partner who's very schizophrenic, constantly changing attitudes, behavior, like a stock market, going up and down, scaring you every time it goes down and making you happy that it goes up. But then you get affected. It's important that we not get affected by variability, because climate change will be variable. Look at the trends. And even in the stock market, my son, who's an investment banker, said carbon dioxide is up. Temperature, look at temperature. See that bell curve? This is actual data. Frequency of El Nino is up. Over the last 27 years, every month has been hotter than the average temperature for the 20th century. The northern hemisphere is heating up much more than the southern hemisphere. The intertropical convergence zone is moving away from the equator. Ice melt has accelerated. How will this affect, for example, Singapore's shipping business once ships can sail through the Arctic? The enhancement of the water cycle. We're seeing this all throughout Southeast Asia. We found out sea level rise is not flat, it's actually like this. And if you look at the areas in the world where sea level rise is happening, guess where it is? It's here. The most sea level rise is here. I mentioned storms. We are seeing more and more intense storms. We just had a 370, 360 kph typhoon. And Southeast Asia, particularly the Philippines, Japan, and some parts of southern China, are ground zero. In short, for climate change, it will get worse before it gets better. Don't pray that it will just suddenly disappear. It won't. Those are the trends. Look at the countries and the cities of Southeast Asia. Asia, actually. Most of us have our cities built on deltas, river mouths, floodplains. Those are traces of our colonial past, except for Thailand, which was never colonized. But still, many of us used to go around by boats. Rivers were our highways, lakes were our plazas. We had no roads. And so many of our cities are built by the water. That is a historical reality. Unfortunately, in a climate change future, that is a future of vulnerability. Virtually every major city in Asia faces that same threat. The areas in red show you the areas that are virtually 1 to 2 meters above sea level. You saw earlier how much the sea level could rise. You saw how Southeast Asia has recorded highest sea level increase in 2010. Just like the Philippines, when you look at these images of Asia, it is very clear that there is no part of Asia that can call itself exempt. That's why it's called global warming, right? It will affect all of us. Over the last 3 years, WWF here in the Philippines has been doing a study with the Bank of the Philippine Islands where we have looked at the business of adaptation. In other words, what are the climate risks that each city faces and what are the opportunities that will arise out of climate change? And I want you to take that with you today, that climate change is actually an opportunity. It's part of our link to the Chinese heritage we have throughout Asia, where for Chinese, behind every crisis, there is an opportunity. So we look at climate change that same way. We looked at 12 Philippine cities so far. We're looking at 4 more this year. Why are we looking at cities? Because of urbanization. It is said that by 2050, 70% of the population of Asia will live in cities. Everybody wants the jackpot. Everybody wants to have the big paying job. Nobody wants to farm anymore. Nobody wants to catch fish. Everybody wants to work in a BPO or a bank, carry a fancy cell phone. That's the unfortunate truth. But you see, one of the things we found out in this study is when urbanization advances, agriculture retreats. Think about that. We live in a part of the world, that circle. More than half of the world's population lives within that circle. You know something striking? Take a close look at the circle. More than half of it is water. And yet more than half of the world's population lives there. Many of the world's megacities are here in Asia Pacific. What's happening? And we expect the population of Asia Pacific to continue to grow primarily around cities. There are indirect impacts that will arise from climate change, and one of them has to do with health. Okay? This is the pathogen that carries malaria. You see, the link is like this. You have fossil fuels and CO2. That creates the 6 scenarios I talked to you about, which leads to a systemic health risk. This will involve both new and old diseases. Some of the diseases are here. For a long time we have known about malaria, about dengue. Recently we found out about chikungunya. But there are some diseases we thought we had mastered, which have actually returned. Very basic, like tuberculosis. You see, nature maintains a balance. And this regulates the population of organisms that affect our health. When you have mosaics of habitats and biodiversity, you have that balance in place. However, because of human activity, that balance has been disrupted. And because of that, we have a situation where these organisms that affect our health will be allowed to develop. Climate change makes it worse. You have shifts in 4 levels. Climate, natural systems, which lead to shifts in the range of infectious disease and which leads to shifts in public health and society. That is an indirect impact of climate change, but it's something we have to recognize. For example, why did I put a rat up there? I hope nobody here is scared of rats. It's a rat up there. You see, we live in Asia, and in Asia we grow a lot of rice. And whenever there's a lot of rain, which I told you there will be, in 21 days, rats give birth. That's how long it takes them for them to reproduce. And they eat the rice. That's why I put that there, because it's not just malaria, it's not just mosquitoes. There are many other organisms influenced. The United Nations, in a study in 2008, said that one of the greatest indirect impacts of climate change will be forced migration. This is an actual photograph taken this month of people that were being evacuated from Tacloban in central Philippines. It's estimated by the UNHCR that 1.9 million Filipinos were on the move last week away from areas damaged by the storm. It is natural, it is human nature to want to take your family away from areas of risk and move them into areas of refuge, right? But if you do that, what will happen is that the cities or the countries which are seen as refuge will become hyperdense. There will be resource challenges, there will be health challenges, access challenges, so on and so forth, so on and so forth. So even if a country is not in the path of storms, if it is seen as a benign, hospitable area where people can live and work and study, people will move. It is estimated by that same UN study that as many as 140 million Asians will be climate refugees. Globally, it is estimated that the impact will involve 1 billion people by 2050. But we can't blame climate change for everything, right? Why? Because of the human footprint, particularly here in Asia. You see, we live in the Anthropocene, the age of humankind, where our activity affects the biosphere. We can no longer look at biological processes as standalone because the drivers of change have become human activity. And this has been barely in the last 50 years. You see a period they call the Great Acceleration, where major elements of economic growth have suddenly blown through the roof. Globally, humanity's footprint is 50% beyond the sustainable limits of the planet. This is validated by the Global Footprint Report, which is released every 2 years, where we draw up a ratio between the ecological footprint per capita and the biocapacity per capita. Why is biocapacity the second item? It's because we depend on nature for environmental services. And biocapacity is our natural capital inventory from which we draw. How does Asia Pacific compare to the rest of the world? This is a video, actual satellite images showing you the growth of Shenzhen in 6 years. Take a look. That is how quickly Asia Pacific has been developing. In comparison to the world, which is 50% beyond the sustainable limits of the planet, Asia Pacific is 77% beyond the sustainable limits of the region. The Philippines is 117% beyond the sustainable limits of our country. And Manila is 3,400% beyond the sustainable limits of the city. You know, look at the figures below. You want to look at the ratio? If you have a calculator nearby, you do the math. 1.7 divided by 0.05. How many cities of Asia fall into that same category? They represent concentrated risk. It's like we have to look at development through a climate lens, because we don't want to expose 70% of Asians to that high risk I'll give you an idea what I'm talking about. After Fukushima, the mayor of Tokyo was asked 3 days later, how many days of food did Tokyo have when the earthquake happened? You know, he did not know. This was Tokyo. Let me ask you now, how many days of food do you have at home? Do you have any water? In case your water gets cut. There's a big earthquake that's supposed to hit Manila one of these decades. And they say that the scenario shows that 4,000 sections of water pipe will explode because of the earthquake. So how then? See, so you have to look at how you can spread out that risk and how each of us can make a difference. Darwin, statement attributed to him. Some people say he didn't really say it, but it makes sense. Right? It is those who respond to a changing world that survive. What are the things, if we talk about climate action, that need attention? Land use. Global population is going to grow from 7 billion to 9 billion in the next 30 years. And of that 9 billion, 5.5 will be here. Okay? So we really have to figure out how to peg down land use. What use contributes to the greater good? And maybe it is something we should be doing as a region, as ASEAN, rather than as simple countries. Because some areas just have no more land, whereas other areas like Myanmar have lots of land. So how do we balance it off such that the footprint of Southeast Asia maintains within something sustainable? One of the things we have realized in the Philippines is everything you do in the uplands will affect everything that happens on the coast. Everything goes down. And therefore, you cannot look at forest management separate from coastal management. And the city is here, so you cannot look at the city separate from nature. And on the slope, you have runoff that moves down from the forest, so you have to look at that as well and how you can impound water. You have to look at ecosystems as the management unit. Okay. Aside from land, we have to look at water. There will be major changes in the quantity, the quality, and the timing of water. I'll repeat that. Think about it carefully. There will be a change in the quantity of water and the timing, and in the quality. If we have no forests, we have no water. If we have no water, we have no rice. It's so simple. We have to look at this Singaporean example where they have invested heavily in multi-sourced supply. You know, Singapore has a 4-tap strategy. where for many years they were dependent on Malaysia, and they said, to hell with it, we're going to figure out how to solve our water problem. And so Singapore started desalinating, but very expensive. Then they said, okay, we will create new water. They create drinking water from sewage. So it's complete recycling. You look at the water, it's clean, it's clear. And they catch rain. 88% of Singapore's houses, buildings, highways catch rain. How many percent of our buildings and houses in our countries catch rain? And how many of our cities still drill for wells, trying to get water from the ground? These images from Thailand, 2011. How many of you were in that flood? This is not strange to Filipinos as well. We have seen this. A couple of years ago, I was asked to go to Penang to give a talk, and I know in the province right beside Penang, they had major floods 2 weeks before. The rails were closed, the airport was closed. The railways were closed. They had to truck in water from the next province. So it's not unique to Thailand. The big question really here is, how much of this can we afford? There are ways we can prepare for changes in water quantity. At a catchment scale, I talk about ecosystems. At a city scale, at a subdivision or community scale, and at a home or a building scale. Everyone can be part of the solution. Once a 10-year-old boy asked me, I'm 10 years old, what can I do? And I said, how much time do you spend in the shower? 30 minutes? 20 minutes? Then you can do something, maybe you can cut it down to 5. Because it's not just supply, it's demand as well, and how we use water. You know, here in the Philippines, I'm sure in many of your countries, bottled water is very popular. And some people say, that's the solution. And I said, no, it's not. 1 liter of bottled water costs 20 pesos. There are 1,000 liters in 1 cubic meter. Therefore, it's 20,000 pesos per cubic meter. Does it make sense to drink bottled water when you can get tap water for 27 pesos? Why would you pay 20,000? Right? So it's not a solution. In fact, the UN calls it a maladaptation. It's a simple commercial exercise. But what's happening is gouging the consumer. You don't have to pay that much. Even if you bought the most expensive water filter for your home, it would be cheaper than that. You think about it. We talked about land, we talked about water, now we talk about food. We have to look about food security. In Tacloban, after the big typhoon, people were always going around asking for food. We have overfished our oceans. We have. In many parts of Southeast Asia, the tuna that used to be there are no longer there. Many of them have become sardines because we've wiped out most of the larger fish. Many of the reefs are destroyed. And we're getting fishing boats from China, from the United States, from Europe, coming into our waters, catching our fish. And in some places, our local governments have been allowing them to do so. Now, this is something we have to regulate because we have to think about our own food security in the region. I think beyond the seas, we have to look at rationalizing agriculture and aquaculture, figuring out how to do it right. Many people say aquaculture is bad because it pollutes the river or it pollutes the lake. And some people from Europe recently said, oh, it's very bad because they use carnivorous fish. And I said, that's only Europe, that's salmon. Here in Asia, we use carp, we use milkfish. These are herbivorous fish, these are not carnivores. So there are many other areas where we can grow herbivorous fish. You don't have to grow a carnivore. And a herbivore just eats, what, algae. It's fine. We can do that. So rather than saying that this is a problem, I recommend that we think about, let's find a solution. Every problem has a solution. And if you can't figure it out, maybe you're not the right person to do it. Maybe you need an engineer. So how much, this is what happened in Davao, in southern Mindanao, after a typhoon, Pablo, last year. They lost about 60,000 hectares of banana. And it would take them 18 to 24 months for the crop to renew. They lost 3 million coconut trees. It would take them 5 years to get it back up. How much of that can we afford? Rice. All of us grow rice. It takes 4,700 liters of water to grow 1 kilo of paddy rice. Next time you eat rice, think about how much water was consumed to grow the rice you ate. Food, water, land, energy. We have to look at building a balanced energy mix. The dependence on fossil fuels has created climate change. It has also created a system whereby we are actually making life worse and more expensive as we're moving along. I'll give you an idea. According to the International Energy Agency, the price of oil and gas, coal and gas, is going to go in one direction over the next 20 years, up. And therefore, it will affect the cost of living and the cost of doing business. And when something is bad for business and increases the cost of living, it affects politics. Now, so we have to look at the future. 130 years ago, we used to grease the engines of industry with whale oil. And then somebody discovered the magic of petroleum. And the whole world shifted to petroleum. We now know it was a mistake. But, let's put that aside. If you were in that situation today, would you have shifted to petroleum or would you have stuck to whale oil? You would have shifted. We are in that same situation today. We are shifting to renewable energies which will keep us fueled forever. So will you stick with petroleum or will you shift to renewables? Will you be part of what is new or will you stick to what is existing? The world thrives and grows because of change. Just remember that. We have to look at renewables. How we can decouple our dependence from a commodity or from commodities that constantly fluctuate and in many cases make other people rich. The cost of the sun remains the same. So does the cost of the wind. So does the cost of steam. So think about these things as we move on, because cost will be everything. We have to look at transport and telecommunications. Very, very critical if we're going to look at climate adaptation. Why? Unless you deliver your goods, you have no business. Right? This image shows you every ship that is at sea in one day. You can look at the website, sail.wx. And it shows you how 90% of the world's cargo goes by ship and how we are so dependent on shipping. Have we fixed our ports? Have we fixed our new ships to prepare for a climate-defined future? These are things we have to be asking ourselves today. This is a study made by Stanford University, where they looked at what you have to do to retrofit the seaports of the world. They looked at the 155 largest seaports of the world to prepare them from sea level rise and for storm surge. There is a tremendous opportunity here for infrastructure. But unless we make the investment in the future, what happens to the great seaports of Southeast Asia? You know how bad it is. General Santos, which is down in the south, very near Singapore, very near KL, very near Malaysia, they built the port where it had a 2.5 meter gap between the top of the port and the highest high tide. Last year, that gap was 1/2 meter. Okay? We have to accept the reality that seas will be rougher and therefore we have to redesign our ships. Otherwise, imagine if you were carrying glass in that container. Education. We have to invest in human capital because it's creativity and brains and human decisions that will move us forward. We have to look at investing in brains rather than in buildings. beyond the formal educational system, as more and more and more Asians come into the network, we have to accept that many of them may not be able to go to college, may not be able to go to regular school. And therefore, how do you keep them productive? How do you be able to give them opportunities so they don't become a weight on the shoulders of Southeast Asia? They must be trained in some way. So there has to be a way to make investments in what they now call lifelong learning. How you keep people learning through virtual means rather than simply through the formal educational system. WWF was asked by the Philippine government to write this policy paper on the green economy to explain what is sustainable development, what is sustainable consumption and production. We looked at the Philippines and we found out a very curious pattern that seems to apply to many developing countries. You see the two lines, that's GDP and what they call materials input, or the draw of natural resource. And every increase in gross domestic product was accompanied by an increase in withdrawal of natural resource. We looked at 6 OECD countries and we saw a different pattern. You see that pattern? You see that red dot, that red arrow in between, the gap? What's that? And we realized that was value added. In other words, just rather than selling ore, you sell an ingot. Rather than selling fresh fish, you sell fillets packaged with vacuum. So you add value to a product. Why is that important? And this is an important point for ASEAN. If it is to come together as a single economic unit, we have to learn how to keep the velocity of money moving within our circles. If most of that money goes out, then the money will be made elsewhere. Give you an example. Of course, this is a very micro example. There was a community of very poor people here in Manila that was studied by an economist. And he found out that that community made 25 million pesos a year. So Philippines speaking, they had a lot of money moving around their community. But he found out that all that money they earned, 95% was spent on goods and services outside. And only 5% stayed inside the community. As a result, they were exporting the wealth out, and they were keeping very little in. Now, if, for example, ASEAN is able to figure out a way by which we can allow that wealth that we create to move around our circles, we will be able to realize the full potential of what we now call the Asian century. When people ask me, how do you define sustainable development in a climate-defined future? I say, think of these 6 words. These are 3 chains. One chain is the chain between source and use. Another one is the chain between supply and demand. And the third one is the chain between today and tomorrow. And if you link up source with use, supply with demand, today and tomorrow, and allow more of that wealth to stay within your circles, that defines sustainable development. What does the 21st century look like? These 2 images, developed by NOAA and NASA, give you a prediction, a peek into the future for both heat and for rain. You can see very clearly that we're not headed for an easy time. When I talk about this in various parts of the country, especially in the cities where we did the studies, we looked back and I asked people, what are the main drivers of development here? And in 7 of the 8 cities that we first studied, they said governance. It is important to remember that governance is not government. Governance is management. Okay? Governance is you and I. And if your country enjoys what my country enjoys, democracy is not merely freedom. Democracy is participation. And if we are to make ASEAN all it can be, then there is a role for each of us to be part of the solution and to participate in building an ASEAN that is ready to deal with a climate-defined future. Thank you very much. Questions?